Thanks a million. I have been looking forward to seeing you all week. So it's Friday, and I've been waiting all week. So hello, how nice to meet you. Right, I'm Mariette, and you're probably thinking, "Wow, two chiefs in your title. That's pretty cool." The chief judge of Google Science Fair part of it is by far the most fun part of it, most awesome part of it. So I hope you will think about the Google Science Fair. But let me talk to you for just a minute about the 170 years of Scientific American part. And Scientific American was started right here in New York, where you guys all are. And the guy who started had this great name, Rufus Porter, which I loved. And he had offices here where scientists and inventors would actually come to visit. So you all know what your iTunes or whatever you're listening to, your music. The first time voice was ever heard outside of the labs of Thomas Edison. Who raise your hand if you heard of this guy, Thomas Edison? The light bulb, right? Right, but he also invented this thing that in the time was called the phonograph, and he brought it to Scientific American. And you could probably imagine, like the editors are probably thinking, what's this giant box this guy has? He puts this cylinder on it, and it plays, and it says, "Hello, how do you like the talking box?" And that was pretty surprising and awesome. And he did that using science. And it took him a long time to do it, and he worked away at it. And then Thomas Edison and a lot of other inventors made a lot of other things, a lot of which we're all using right now. This microphone, the phones that you're not allowed to tweet and Snapchat on and everything else on that we've been told about, the building we're in, all of this stuff was invented, improved, through the process that we call science. Because science is not something you read about in a history book like we might read about Thomas Edison. No, it's a way we think. It's a way we do stuff. It's a way we ask a question. How could we hear stuff from people when they're not in the room? Well, phonograph, later phone, microphone. How could we cure diseases? How could we solve problems for people? So science is all about that. And it's about a way of exploring and discovering, and anybody can do it. So maybe you think that's something that people do in a lab, or you have to be a genius like Thomas Edison. Maybe I don't know, let me ask you this question. Raise your hand if you've ever met a scientist. You ever met one? Okay, I see a lot of good hands, but actually, everybody put your hand up. Everybody was born a scientist. Everybody here was born a scientist. How do I know that? Because I told you, science is a way of looking at the world and thinking. Think of a baby in a high chair. Do you ever watch a baby in a high chair? There's a meatball there, there's a Cheerio. Baby goes, psh. Watch what happens. Throw the Cheerio. Cheerio goes down different. If they have a feather, the feather falls differently still. That is a baby scientist running an experiment. And you all can do that. Everybody does that. Everybody does it every day. You just don't think of it like that. You just don't call it that. But that is science. And so I encourage you. And by the way, this thing of science, I told you, inventions and so on, for the grown-ups in the room, between World War II and now, about a third to a half of all of the U.S.'s economic growth is from basic research that led to inventions like the ones we're all enjoying today. And so let me just tell you guys who are listening to me, ask the question. Ask a question, ask something you want, apply the testing, find out what happens, and when you find out what happens, you should really think about entering the Google Science Fair. So now I'd love to introduce you to one of my favorite scientists, Shree, who you've heard a little bit about. And I first met Shree in 2011. When I was the first time chief judge of the Google Science Fair, and I was inspired by her questions as Shree saw a problem. She had I feel very awful about her grandfather dying of cancer. And she had a question of why do some therapies not work anymore with cancer? And she worked on that question. And she kept working on it and has done so many other amazing things since. So I know you're all so lucky, as I am, to meet her here and to hear what she's going to tell us all. And I can't wait to hear it myself. So welcome, please, to Shree.
All right. I am really excited to be here today, guys. Like, so excited. I am really excited about doing something a little bit different today. So instead of just talking at you guys, I want to make sure you talk back at me. All right? So be sure, please interact, please engage. If there's something that doesn't make sense to you, type in questions and ask me whatever you want to, all right? So I'm a scientist, which means I'm trained to ask questions. That's how everything I've done started. So during this talk, I want you guys to channel your inner scientist, okay? And whenever you think of a question, I want you to go to this link that's going to appear on the screen and just type it in so I can see it. And throughout my entire talk, I want you guys to keep asking those questions. So by the end, we can answer them and see what matters to you guys, what you guys care about, and we can get some answers going. All right. Is everyone going to do that? Yeah? Okay, awesome. Well, I told you guys I like questions, right? Well, I wasn't kidding about that. So I want to answer the types of questions that can change the world. But when I was that little kid, I wasn't really always like that. I mean, at the time, I was really a self-centered science geek. Well, what does that mean, right? Well, that meant that I liked thinking of problems that I had. I liked playing with science to make my life better. And that led to some pretty crazy projects, I'm not gonna lie to you. In 3rd grade, I literally did my first science project because I didn't like eating my vegetables. So quick show of hands, how many of you guys like spinach? Whoa, how many of you guys don't like spinach? All right, I'm with you guys, I'm with you haters. All right, so when I was in 3rd grade, I decided that I wanted to make spinach more exciting to eat. So I was gonna turn it blue. Sounds great, right? Blue spinach, that's something you'd eat. So my parents, bless their souls, went out, bought me a spinach plant, some blue food coloring, and a syringe. You should not give a syringe to a 3rd grader, for the record. But I took this blue food coloring and I proceeded to inject it into this spinach plant. And then I forgot about it for 2 months. And I remember on the day of this science fair, I pulled out this dried, withered, gross spinach plant with like blotches of blue on it. And I took that in as my very first science project. And I wish I could say it like got better from there, but my next project I literally did because I didn't like taking out the trash. In fact, I hated the idea of rolling that giant garbage can to the curb every week so much that I decided to build a remote-controlled garbage can. I mean, how lazy is that? And I remember I built this little model of a trash can, and it was like a tiny little replica. And on the day of the science fair, I took it in, and the science fair was held in our gym. And I remember I just spent the day piloting this little trash can around other people's projects instead of actually presenting it. And these were fun times, right? They were fun projects. Everyone was laughing. It was a lot of fun, but I wasn't really asking the types of questions that could change the world. In fact, I really didn't ask the important scientific questions until I turned 15 years old. And then I went from this kid who was doing silly science projects to a kid who wanted to cure cancer. When I was 15, my grandfather passed away. My grandfather was one of the most organized people I've ever met. He was the kind of person who would save hundreds of horribly taken pictures from like family road trips that were blurry and awful, and he would label them and keep them in photo albums for years. And he had these file cabinets that were just full of chronologically ordered National Geographic magazines that were 30 years old. But that wasn't the man I saw towards the end of his life. My grandfather had become bedridden. He was dependent. He wasn't the same grandfather I had grown up with. And that was hard. That was really hard to see. And he wasn't alone in that experience. I mean, A lot of people all over the world are affected by cancer. Maybe some of you guys, maybe some of your family members. I mean, by the numbers, there are millions. But usually it just takes one to really want to make a difference. And for me, my grandfather was my one. And I knew I had to do something. So what do you do when you have a lot of big questions and very few answers? Well, I did what any 15-year-old would do, and I Googled it. I started reading everything I could get my hands on. I read scientific articles. I read blog posts from cancer patients who were going through chemotherapy. I even read some pretty nutty conspiracy theories about cancer. And I remember I learned a lot. I was learning every day. And I would learn outside of class, and then I would go into the classroom, and we would see these diagrams of how cancer supposedly happened. And I remember one day sitting in class, seeing this diagram of this piece of DNA, and there was a tiny lightning bolt hitting it. And my teacher said, "That's how cancer happens. It's just genes getting damaged. That's it." And I remember staring at that tiny little lightning bolt and thinking, this is just not enough. And so all of the reading I was doing, all of the information that I had gathered, all of the questions I was asking that I was getting answers to, all of it was building to something bigger. At some point, I realized the questions that I was asking were actually listed as questions on the research goal pages for professors and universities and graduate labs. The same questions I was asking as a 15-year-old were questions that the entire scientific community was asking. And that was incredible, right? That was the stepping stone. And I realized at that point that I couldn't have the sort of impact I wanted to make alone. I had to find help. So, in a similar way to how you would find a restaurant to eat at tonight by searching a few keywords on Google, I found professors. I started emailing hundreds of professors at local labs and universities, and I started off all of my emails with the first line saying, "Hi, my name is Shree Bose. I'm 15 years old, and I want to do cancer research." Sounds insane, right? Well, all of the professors I emailed must have thought so, because I got rejected by all of them. I mean, it got to a point where the rejections almost didn't faze me anymore. It was almost like my knee-jerk reaction to one rejection would be, okay, we're on to the next professor, the next opportunity, the next chance. I was on a mission, and I wasn't going to stop until I found somebody to take me on. So, fully expecting another rejection, I emailed Dr. Alokananda Basu, a professor at the University of North Texas Health Science Center. Same email, and for the first time, I got a response that wasn't, "Oh, you're too young," or, "Oh, please don't contact me again." It was, "Come into my lab and we can chat. We can see why you're excited about this, what makes you tick." And so I remember on this beautiful spring day in Fort Worth, Texas, I made my mom drive me to a graduate lab. And I remember I was sitting in this graduate lab. There were researchers next to me. They were pouring buffers and doing cool looking stuff. And that was before I knew the science. And I remember sitting there shaking. I was physically shaking because all I wanted to do was to work in this lab. And I was so scared. And I remember at the time, the email I was writing to all of these professors actually had an idea for a project that I kind of thought might work, and it was a cool idea. And Dr. Basu walks into this lab, and one of the first things out of her mouth is, "I read your proposal, and it didn't make any sense. It would never work." And I remember all of my muscles tensed up. I was like, oh God, here comes the rejection, here we go. And then she went on, and she said, but I liked the way you thought through it. I liked where you were going. I liked the way you questioned this entire problem. And so if you want, you can come work in my lab for the summer. And that was it. That was where it all started after these months of absolutely making a fool of myself and just writing nonsensical ideas to these professors who knew so much more than me. It was really that gave me the chance to do something amazing. So don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to reach out when you realize that you can't have the sort of impact you want alone, because it's one of the most powerful things you can do. For me, I started working in this lab as a freshman in high school, as a just finished freshman year of high school. I was working in this lab. I was assigned this project on drug resistance in breast cancer. So basically understanding why some cells stop responding to a drug. And for the first summer, I remember I just bumbled around. I broke glassware. I dropped experimental results that took days to redo. I annoyed literally everybody in this lab all the time, asking the dumbest questions. And I remember along the way, I learned a lot of really, really, really cool things. And I remember as I was learning, I kind of fell in love with research. It was incredible. I felt like it was just so powerful to be able to think through a problem and go from beginning to end and have an experimental result that could tell you something about a cancer patient who might be suffering from breast cancer, or a patient who's being told that the breast cancer has come back. And that was incredibly powerful to me. Also, I never looked like that in lab. That's a very intense picture. But I remember at the time I was so excited about what I was working on. And I wanted to share it with everybody who would listen to me. And I remember at the end of the summer, we had this project. I had finished this complete project. It was on drug resistance, breast cancer, and I was ready to enter it into another science fair. And I mean, this is a science fair I've been competing in since I was a little kid, and this project is better than blue spinach and remote-controlled garbage cans, right? And I remember I went to the science fair, I presented my project, and at the awards ceremony, I won nothing. I remember I walked out of this room and I was empty-handed, I was sad, I had a feeling like I never wanted to do research again. I mean, I had fallen in love with biology and medicine, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever, and it turned out I kind of sucked at it. And that was dark. That was a crushing sort of feeling. And I remember at the time, I decided I would turn my attention away from research. I would stop doing that. I was going to focus on poetry and moping. Those were going to be my two things. That was it. And I kept it up for quite a few months. I remember I felt just so downtrodden by everything that had happened. But after 3 months, I was still sitting in biology class, and still what I was learning still was not enough. And I remember the reason I had joined a lab in the first place was because I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to understand. I wanted to know how this disease that had killed my grandfather worked and how we could make it better for everybody else who was suffering. And so I went back the next year. I remember I was given the choice. I was given the choice to either work on this old project on breast cancer, or I could come up with a new project on ovarian cancer. I just jumped at that opportunity. I was like, I'll do that. And so over the course of the next summer, I actually developed this really cool project on drug resistance in ovarian cancer along with my mentor. And so basically what that meant is we wanted to understand why some cells died when we gave them a chemotherapy drug and why some cells didn't. And so that basically would correlate, that would mean that we could understand better why some patients stopped responding to some medicines. Really big stuff, and we discovered a really cool thing, basically that this one energy protein that's involved in how cells process energy is actually really important in how that switch happens. And so I remember at the time I did this really cool project. I really wanted to share it with the world, but it was science fairs and I was kind of scared. And one day I got a call from my dad. And my dad said, "Hey, have you been on the homepage of Google today? There's something right under the search bar that I think you would be interested in." So I said, "No," and then I went online. And right under the search bar, it said, "Introducing the first ever Google Global Science Fair." And I thought, I wouldn't have done any of this without Google. And I want to share what I have figured out with the world. So all of my work, all of my passion, all of my excitement, I put that all into this really cool website, and I sent off the link, and a few months later, I found out that I was going to Mountain View. So I was one of 15 global finalists, which meant that when I went to California, I was with 14 other kids who also were doing projects that could change the world. And I remember at one point we had to have these public booths where you brought stuff and showed it off to the public who would come in and want to know about your project. And they told us to bring in something that was either representative of us or representative of our project. And I worked with cancer, so you can't really bring in cancer cells. So I decided, since I'm from Texas, I would bring in a cowboy boot and a statue of a cowboy, which is a great idea if you think about it. It's great. Only problem was that at some point in transit, the cowboy's head came off. So on my table, I had a headless cowboy statue, and the kid next to me had a fully functional robotic Lego arm. And at that point, I was like, all right, we're done. We're done here. We're not winning. We're okay. It's fine. And so I remember just knowing that made me so much calmer. So when I went in to talk to the judges, I was honest. Mariette was one of my judges. And I remember I was brutally honest. There were points I would talk about messing up in lab and getting rejected and why I was so excited to be able to work on a project like this. And when I won the Google Science Fair in 2011, it didn't feel like I was winning just because of the work. It felt really like it was an award for my passion, for how determined I was, for how excited I was to be able to work on this thing that had affected me so closely. It felt like it was really an award for all of the kids who have ever been told that they're too young to do something, or kids who have told themselves that they can't do something because of age or gender or opportunity. It was an honor to win the Google Science Fair. And after that, I got to do a lot of really, really cool things, including getting to meet President Obama twice. And there was just something about seeing such a powerful person who was so passionate about getting kids excited about science and technology and engineering and math that just made me excited to be able to share my mentorship with the entire world. And over the past few years, I have gotten to do a lot of really exciting things. I've made some of my best friends at Harvard. I started a company to help kids get started with building technology and learning about engineering hardware. I was one of Glamour magazine's top 10 college women, where they put a lot of makeup on you and make you look a lot better. I've gotten to do research at Harvard Medical School, and I'm going on to start my career in medicine and research. And it's been a really, really exciting journey. But I never thought of myself as an inventor or a scientist or an entrepreneur. Honestly, I just asked the questions that mattered the most to me, whether that was how to turn spinach blue or how to cure cancer. And so today I want you to do something with me. I want you to think about the problems that matter to you. The world is this giant, beautiful place, and there's so much left to explore and discover. So let's think about it for a second. What are those questions that matter to you? And now I want you to go do something with that. Because that's where everything I have done so far has begun, with a question. And that's where I want your stories and your journeys to begin as well. So today I want you to find your questions, make your opportunities, and create your own answers. Because together, I know we can do incredible things in this world if we only begin to ask how. Okay. Thank you, guys. All right, so you guys did a really great job with asking questions. So I'm going to go to these questions. Ooh, we've got a lot.
Yeah,
oh,
you do.
Yes. All right, let's go with the top voted one from Layla, who asks, making the world better sounds hard. How do I even start? And I love this question because it's not something you really think about. You don't start off by saying, well, I want to change the world. You start off by saying, this is something that bothers me and I want to figure it out. And then you find out that this thing that bothered you actually bothers a lot of people. That's how it all starts. So, okay, you asked, how do you even start? Good question. I want all of us to take 1 second and think about a problem that you've run into today, just today. Maybe it's not even your problem. Maybe it's a problem that your parents ran into or a friend or somebody else. But let's think of that problem. All right, got it? Okay. Now I want you to think about how you would solve it. Is there an easy way to do that? Well, start with that. That's how you start changing the world. That's how everything begins, is really finding a problem that impacts you and then trying to come up with solutions that can matter to everyone. But that's a really great question, and thank you, Layla. All right, so second question is, what was it like to meet President Obama? Ooh, so I was so starstruck. I remember this. I was so starstruck. They had us in this little waiting area outside the Oval Office at the very beginning. And the Oval Office has a lot of hidden doors. So there are no like really blatant doors anywhere. And so I remember I was standing, I was facing somebody else talking, and there was a wall behind me. And I turned around, and all of a sudden the wall was gone. It was a door, and President Obama is standing there. And he goes in for the handshake, and I'm so panicked at that point that I just bear hugged him. So it was amazing to meet President Obama. Absolutely, honestly, it was incredible to really see somebody who was in such a high position who very evidently cared so much about getting kids started in science. That's a really powerful thing, and I think it sets a tone for how we approach STEM in this country, and that's incredible, and that's something all of us will benefit from. All right, so thank you, Stephen, for that wonderful question, where I got to share my bear hug with Obama. All right, our next question is from Dre. How can we bridge the gap with the lack of women of color in science and STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and math? And that is a really, really good question because that's something I'm especially passionate about. I mean, I was really lucky. I grew up in a household where it didn't really feel like I couldn't do something. That really wasn't a big thing. So when I wanted to start research, it didn't feel like there were any barriers to making that happen. And so actually, when I was first starting this tech company with my co-founder, who happens to be a man, we ended up going to this tech conference, and our boxes actually look like they're made out of wood, so they look kind of just like regular boxes that you might carry snacks around in. And this tech conference was full, it was mostly 80% men. And I remember we were walking around, and I was holding the box, and I got asked 3 times if there were cookies in the box. And after the 3rd time, I was like, this is weird. This is definitely weird. So I handed it off to my co-founder, and for the next hour he carried it around, the questions he got were, what cool piece of tech is in that box? So I am not, it's really hard to say that these gender divides don't still exist, and they do. And I think one of the most powerful things we can do to bridge that gap that you're talking about here is actually better mentoring. I think that's the key to letting amazing thoughts and amazing people come to the forefront and giving them the chance to really do what they want to do. My entire journey started with mentoring, and I think it's a very powerful thing. All right, so thank you, Dre. Okay, my next question is from, here we go. Is from Steve, who asks, how did you figure out how to get started with your cancer research? And this is an awesome question because honestly, I didn't have sort of a plotted out way to do things. I sort of started reading and reading everything I possibly could, and then just proposing nonsensical ideas to people who knew a lot more than me. But I would say the first step to getting to my journey on getting started with cancer research was by finding a mentor. And so for a lot of you students out in the audience, and even actually for parents and Googlers, I think one of the most powerful things you can do when you want to change something or make something better is to find the people who can help you. And to not be afraid to reach out to those people. Make a fool of yourself if you have to, but eventually that's what makes the difference. That is it. Going out and doing something is the very first step, whether that's reading and then figuring out that you need to find mentors, or just reaching out and talking to people who might be able to help you. So really great question. Thank you, Steve. And okay, so my next question is from Anonymous, who asks, any tips for anyone who wants to apply for the Google Science Fair? This is a really good question because the Google Science Fair is about to open. Okay, show of hands, how many of you guys are going to apply now? There we go. There we go. All right. Woo! So my tips for the Google Science Fair would be to get your projects in early. So make your websites before it's due in a week, which is what I did. But seriously, actually go online, start making your sites as soon as possible. If you have yet to do a project, start finding mentors, ask questions that matter to you, and really follow the templates that are given for the Google Science Fair on how to think through those questions, because they're really a good starting point if you don't know how to go about things yet. So those are probably one of the best tips I can give, actually. My next question, as you guys are voting, it actually pops to the top. So I get to see in real time what you guys care about, and that's an incredible thing. Ooh. So the next, I love this question. What's the next question you'd like to answer with science? So I think I've done a lot of really cool things over the past few years, from like starting a company to doing research to getting to talk to kids and figure out like how to mentor and how to really create networks that matter. And so the next question I'm really excited to answer with science is actually about my initial passions for cancer, for understanding how cancer cells process energy in different ways than normal cells, and whether we can figure out a better way to target cancer cells by understanding those differences. So that's sort of the next big question I'm going for. All right, and I think I have time for one last question. And let me find it. Let's see. A couple more? Oh, sweet, yeah. A couple more answers? All right. I love this question. Okay, what was your most inspiring learning memory in school and outside of school? So this is from Jonathan. Thank you, Jonathan. I think in school, one of my most inspiring learning moments was actually with my biology teacher. When at one point when I wasn't understanding what was happening in class, I went in and I talked to her and I said, this doesn't make sense. And she was one of the first people who said, if this doesn't make sense, try to find some higher level things. And I remember at the time, the things I was reading didn't really make sense. Like the scientific articles were full of jargon. So I went from having to Google every other word, and as I read more, I would have to Google every fifth word, and that was progress. But that was one of my most inspiring moments, was this teacher really telling me that, learn outside of just this classroom. Learn as much as you possibly can and use all of the tools you have to figure out what information you want to get. Outside of school, actually, is one of my earliest memories with science that actually sort of solidified why I was excited about science. I grew up with an older brother. He's 2 years older than me, super cool. And when we were little, I remember he would come home every day, and since I was younger and the only person he could boss around, he would make me sit down and he would explain everything he learned in science class. And I remember he had this spark in his eye, and there's just something magical about being taught by somebody who's so obviously excited about what he's saying that just, I remember looking at him and thinking, I want to be that excited. I want to be that excited about atoms and molecules and cells and things that I didn't even understand, but let us break apart the world and put it back together again. And so I think that was one of my most inspiring, just general memories in life, has been sort of the influence of my older brother and having him teach me and still teach me throughout my entire life. All right, okay, a few more questions. So let me go up. I really like this question because it's actually very relevant to all of the students in the audience. So Kirti, thank you. How did you balance schoolwork with being a scientist? And that's hard. I did a lot of these projects during my summers. My friends were out sort of having a good time, and we would meet up and they would tell me about this cool amusement park they went to, or the time they went out to coffee, and I'd be like, do you want to hear about breast cancer though? I think you do. And then I would proceed to explain my project. But it's a level of balance. It really is. And when I was working as a college student, I did research while doing classes at the same time. And it ends up being a juggling act. But I will say, what made that possible is the fact that I loved every single thing that I was doing. So when I was doing research and when I was doing classwork really late at night, it wasn't because I had to be doing it. It was because I wanted to be. And I think that if you can find the things that you love, that balance becomes so much easier. But it is a balancing act, and it really requires a level of organization that I think you will definitely develop when you find what you love and you're working on it. Okay, all right. Few more questions. Sorry. Okay, this is from Anonymous. What was the most enjoyable part of your research? I've told you so many experiences of messing up in lab, right? I told you about breaking things and messing up results and asking questions that made no sense. But I think my most enjoyable part of research was actually getting results that made sense. I remember there was a moment in lab where I actually got this film, the result came out as this film, and it just had blobs on it. And for anybody else looking at this result, it would make no sense. It just looks like blobs on this film. And I remember I was standing in lab, I was looking at it, and one blob was bigger than the other, and that meant something. That meant something for why cancer cells weren't responding. And I was holding these results, and I was thinking of patients who would be impacted by the results that I was getting. And just that feeling of being able to think through from beginning to end and get something that mattered was one of the most powerful feelings I have ever had. And that's been my most enjoyable part of research, and it continues to be, even many years later when I've been doing research for many more years. So if you ever start research, I hope you, or research or anything really, I hope you hold on to that sort of passion and that sort of excitement for what you do. All right. Last question? Okay, let me pick a good one. Oh, so many. You guys did a good job. This is an important question. And thank you to C. Sutton for asking it. Did your friends ever make fun of you and call you a nerd for being so into science? So hands up, how many of you guys, is that a concern for you? Yeah, it definitely is, right? And I think that's why things like the Google Science Fair are so important, because they make it into this platform that's awesome. Like, you come back as a rock star, and that's an incredible thing. But, I mean, yes, you might get called a nerd. You might get called a geek. You might get called a lot of names along the way. And what you always have to remember when that happens, when that ever happens, is that you are doing things that matter. What you are doing is something you love, and the questions you are asking will be the sorts of things that you solve, and the solutions will matter to the world. And in 10, 20 years, I know the whole "it gets better" thing is cliched, but I want you to remember that that love and that passion that takes you into science is stronger than any name you will ever be called. And as long as you always remember that, and as long as you have people in your life, including me, who are willing to look at you and say, what you are doing is amazing, and the scientist that you are is incredible, I think you're never going to find yourself wanting to go away from science, because it's truly an amazing thing to be a part of, and it's truly the way you can change the world. So I think that was my last question. Awesome. All right.
Thank you so much, Shree. That was so good. Everyone, can we please give a big round of applause for Shree?